The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise tonight in this debate on the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, negotiated by our government over several years in a form that is truly revolutionary for trade agreements, because it not only anticipates the trade in mercantile goods, agricultural products, but trade in services and sharing of professional services and professional recognition across the ocean, Mr. Speaker, dipping into procurement and infrastructure projects, Mr. Speaker. So truly the 21st century benchmark for trade agreements. But as all trade agreements that enter this House, one of the critical sectors for our negotiators has always been agriculture, Mr. Speaker. And agriculture is a sector that is understood well by this government, but more importantly, it's actually the farming families across Canada that are at the centre of much of what this government does on its trade policy work. I'd remind this House that its Conservative governments have granted Canadian exporters, including our farmers, 98% of their market access around the world. 98% of our trade opportunities have been negotiated by Conservative governments, Mr. Speaker. And in many ways, trade and our success in the last few years under this Prime Minister is one of the hallmarks of our economic track record of success that's leading the G7. And at the focus of why these new markets and new opportunities are important to Canada are farming families, Mr. Speaker. Farming families like the Mustard family in my riding of Durham, a sixth-generation dairy farm, Mr. Speaker. Like my colleague from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, who came to Parliament from a dairy background, Mr. Speaker. We have farmers. We heard from my colleague in Prince Albert. We have actual farmers in the House that bring their experience, their knowledge of what's important to farming families to the debate in this Commons and to our negotiated outcomes for our trade agreements, because we've always said we will not reach a trade agreement unless it's a win for all sectors. And that includes supply-managed sectors, Mr. Speaker. That 98% of market access that our government has secured has been done while we've been able to maintain the four pillars of supply management. And I think that, particularly in this global economy, is a real accomplishment. And it's an accomplishment because it's a priority, Mr. Speaker. We've set it out as a key priority for our government in entering these negotiations and obtaining outcomes that are wins for all sectors, including the supply-managed sector, Mr. Speaker. And I've had, it's my privilege in my role as Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade to meet with these sectors, including our supply-managed sectors, and they see that we've been very careful in our negotiations to secure wins for all agricultural commodities, but in particular not sacrificing one for the other. And I think we're very proud of that, Mr. Speaker. And the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, is an example of such success, Mr. Speaker. We are now going to have, when this agreement is implemented, 50,000 tons of access for our beef farmers. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to farmers in Alberta and Ontario. They were struggling for many, many years. In fact, only in the last 2 years have margins on beef become profitable, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen improper trade actions from our largest partner to the south. So it's encouraged us even more to get access for these farmers in global markets. And I'm very proud to be part of a government that secured that, Mr. Speaker, with South Korea, which was so good, the NDP, after 50 years of opposing trade, had to actually acknowledge it was such a great deal, Mr. Speaker. They stood in this House and supported it, stood in this House to support it, Mr. Speaker. And the European deal is equally as ambitious, because our beef producers, some of the world's best, were effectively blocked by a huge 20% tariff, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian Cattlemen Association has estimated that CETA, when implemented for Canada, will represent a $600 million win in that industry alone. That's truly incredible, Mr. Speaker. Equally important is pork. We're going to be able to get 81,000 tons of tariff-free access for fresh or frozen pork products, Mr. Speaker. And I've met with the industry across the country, particularly in Brandon, Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, where there's an underutilized facility needing new markets. And if we can get the provincial government to address the moratorium on hog barns and get production levels up, we have one of the world-class facilities there ready to ramp up to gain access to markets like South Korea and like Europe for our pork products, Mr. Speaker. Another industry that has seen some challenges in the last decade, and so securing new markets will be important. Why is that important, Mr. Speaker? Because price is assured, and a higher price is assured when you have more than one customer. And Canada's been very lucky to sit on the border of a very large and hungry market, Mr. Speaker. So we've been able to rely heavily on the U.S. trade relationship, which is still critical for our country. But having more markets secures better prices for our farmers and reduces risk by diversifying the markets that we can export into. And some of the people in debate tonight have already mentioned a range of other products. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of them. I'm going to focus on a couple that are very important to my riding in Durham, Southern Ontario, which has some of the best agricultural land in Canada. Fresh apples, Mr. Speaker. A 9% tariff rate with the European deal that will come down. The Kemp and Gibson families at Algoma Orchards in Bowmanville and Newcastle have been ramping up their operations, building a facility for processing. This is a brand new market, Mr. Speaker, of 500 million consumers for them. Not far from them, the Stevens family, Charles, Judy, and Courtney, who are famous for creating the first blueberry marshmallows, I believe, in the world, Mr. Speaker. Fresh blueberries, a 14% tariff. So when you start adding tariff rates like that to the cost of goods, they're essentially a wall to access, Mr. Speaker. Well, through the work of this government in the last few years, we've been able to reach an agreement that gets rid of these tariff rates and allows these producers to gain access to a market that represents a bigger market than NAFTA, Mr. Speaker, with some of the largest and most diverse economies of the world, with a strong middle class who want world-class Canadian food products. Across the board, meats, livestock, grain, oil seeds, fruits, produce. I met with the produce producers today who are very bullish on the future due to trade. And this is an opportunity and a deal that represents a win from coast to coast on agriculture, Mr. Speaker. So we've heard about wine and some of the fruits in British Columbia, through to the grain and oil seeds and Durham wheat in the prairies, through to the beef and pork in Ontario, through to fruits and maple syrup in Quebec, frozen potato products, which have had a tariff rate of as high as 17% for PEI in parts of the Maritimes. So, Mr. Speaker, it's really once in a generation that you get such a tremendous opportunity for the agricultural sector that the CETA European trade deal represents. And going to my earlier remarks, Mr. Speaker, the last generational opportunity for Canadian exporters was the U.S. Free Trade Agreement, negotiated with the vision of the Conservative government at that time, Mr. Speaker. It really takes the Conservatives to open these new markets for our farmers, to allow them to diversify their markets and raise their average price, Mr. Speaker. So it's been an honor for me as Parliamentary Secretary to meet with stakeholders from coast to coast to coast, to work with them on their plans to get ready for the market access that CETA will represent. And whether it's the cattle producers or pork in Western Canada or some of the fresh fruit and horticulture sectors here in Ontario, Mr. Speaker, they're ambitious about this opportunity because we have some of the best agricultural businesses in the world, Mr. Speaker, and some of the best products to sell. And now we're giving our farmers more markets to sell them in. It's a huge opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and I hope the NDP will finally get behind it.
Here, here.